Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, and at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The glass walls of Harrison and Associates gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the 42nd floor, reflecting the city skyline of Manhattan like a mirror of ambition itself. It was 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and most of the office had emptied hours ago. A stream of professionals heading toward their real lives, their dinners, their families. But Marcus Harrison remained, as he always did, hunched over his desk with the kind of focused intensity that had built his reputation. He was 34 years old, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, with dark hair slicked back and eyes the color of winter rain. There was something magnetic about him. The kind of handsomeness that came from confidence rather than symmetry, from the way he moved through the world as though he owned it. And until very recently, he had. The problem was this: he didn't anymore. Marcus stared at the financial projections on his screen, his jaw clenching so tightly that a small muscle twitched near his temple. Numbers that should have aligned perfectly were scattered across the spreadsheet like puzzle pieces from different boxes. The Metropolitan Tower project, his baby, his legacy, the development deal that was supposed to cement his status as one of New York's most visionary developers, was hemorrhaging money in ways he couldn't quite explain. 48 hours. That's what Richard Whitmore, the principal investor, had given him. 48 hours to present a comprehensive financial report explaining the discrepancies, or the entire $300 million project would be pulled. The article would be inevitable. Ambitious developer's empire crumbles. The schadenfreude would be delicious for his competitors. Marcus ran his hand through his hair, disrupting the carefully maintained style. He'd made mistakes, impulsive decisions made during a moment of overconfidence. He'd diverted funds without proper documentation, trusted the wrong people, moved money around like he was playing some high-stakes game of financial chess, where the rules didn't quite apply to him. It was the arrogance of a man who'd never really failed, who'd never had to learn that gravity eventually catches everyone. The office was eerily quiet. The cleaning crew had already come and gone. The security guards downstairs were probably watching basketball on their phones. The city outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, indifferent to his crisis. That's when he heard it. The soft ding of the elevator. Marcus didn't look up. He assumed it was security making their rounds, but then he heard footsteps. Hesitant, careful, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who wasn't entirely sure they should be there. "Mr. Harrison?" He glanced up, irritated at the interruption. It took him approximately 2 seconds to identify who had entered his office, and another half-second to realize he couldn't quite remember her name. She was in her early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair that looked like it had been hastily pulled back that morning and had been slowly rebelling against the arrangement ever since. She wore a cream-colored blouse with a coffee stain near the collar. He noticed this with the precision of a man trained to notice details that mattered, and black trousers that had seen better days. Her makeup was minimal, her nails unpainted, her entire presence the kind of thing that the human eye simply slid past without catching on anything memorable. Sophie, that was her name. Sophie. Something. She'd been his secretary for 5 years. He was relatively certain of this. "It's late," he said, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone stating an obvious fact. "You should go home." "I know. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a nervous habit he'd never noticed before, or perhaps had noticed and immediately forgotten. "I was finishing some filing and I saw your light on, and I thought maybe you needed something." Sophie. Right. She made his coffee sometimes. She scheduled his meetings with a competence that was so invisible it might as well not have existed. She laughed quietly at jokes no one else found funny and ate lunch alone at her desk while reading books with worn-out spines. Marcus turned back to his screen. "I'm fine. You can go." He heard her pause, just for a moment, a hesitation that might have contained an entire conversation if he'd been paying attention. But he wasn't paying attention. He was $3 million in the hole and sinking, and he didn't have the bandwidth to notice the invisible woman standing in his office. "Actually," Sophie said, and something in her voice, a thread of determination perhaps, or maybe just desperation, made him look back at her. I was looking at some of the files from the Metropolitan Tower project, trying to organize the expense reports, like you asked me to do last month." Marcus felt a flutter of something in his chest. Irritation, perhaps. The last thing he needed was someone else poking around in the financial disaster that was his life. "Sophie, and I found something." She stepped closer to his desk, her nervousness transforming into something more focused. She set down a folder. Actually, she set down several folders, which she'd been carrying against her chest like some kind of protective armor. The quarterly projections from 3 months ago. The ones from before you restructured the investment allocations. He stared at her. "Okay." "The numbers don't match," she continued, and now he could see something in her eyes, a kind of tentative hope, the look of someone who'd been invisible for so long that having someone actually look at them was almost overwhelming. "The expenses you approved match the original projections, but the revised ones that were submitted to Mr. Whitmore's team, they're different. The variables are shifted. It's subtle, but it's there." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a possibility, a thread of hope in the darkness. "Show me," he said. What followed was 5 hours that seemed to exist outside of time. Sophie spread the documents across his desk with the methodical precision of an archaeologist carefully excavating a dig site. She had sticky notes in 3 different colors, a highlighter, and a worn notebook filled with her small, precise handwriting that documented every discrepancy she'd found. And there were many. As she walked him through each one, Marcus began to see what had happened. Not his mistakes, but someone else's. Someone in his financial team, someone he'd trusted completely, had been systematically altering numbers. Not stealing exactly. It was more sophisticated than that. They'd been adjusting projections in ways that made the project look more profitable than it actually was, creating a false picture that would justify continued investment. It was fraud, but the kind that was almost artistic in its precision. "When did you find this?" Marcus asked, looking at Sophie properly for perhaps the first time in 5 years. "This afternoon. I was just organizing files like you asked, but I got curious because the numbers seemed off, and then I started comparing them and—" She shrugged, a small, self-deprecating gesture. "I mean, I could be wrong. I'm not a financial analyst or anything, but the math doesn't work." Marcus looked at the evidence she'd compiled, looked at the care she'd taken in documenting everything, looked at this woman whom he'd hired 5 years ago without really looking at her, whom he'd spoken to 1,000 times without really listening, whom he'd allowed to become part of the furniture of his life. "You're not wrong," he said quietly. "You're brilliant." Sophie's cheeks flushed, a deep pink that made her suddenly, startlingly visible. She looked away, and he realized with a kind of shock that she was the sort of person who wasn't used to being truly seen. I thought you should know," she said softly, "before your deadline tomorrow." It was 1 in the morning. Sophie had been at the office for 18 hours straight. Her coffee stain looked like it had been there for approximately 17 of those hours. And somehow, in those 18 hours, she'd done what his entire financial team hadn't been able to do. She'd found the missing number. Except it wasn't one number, it was dozens of them. "Thank you," Marcus said, and he meant it with a depth of gratitude that seemed to shock them both. "Really, thank you." Sophie nodded, gathering her things with the quiet competence that was her signature move. "I should go home. You probably have a lot of work to do." "Sophie," he said, and this time when he said her name, it sounded different, like he was actually naming her for the first time. "Stay." She turned back to him, surprise written across her face. "What?" "Stay," he repeated. "I need help going through everything, and you clearly see things I don't." He paused, then added, as though the admission cost him something, "I don't want to do this alone." For a moment, Sophie just stood there, silhouetted against the city lights, looking like she couldn't quite believe she'd heard him correctly. Then slowly, she set down her bag and pulled up a chair. And as they worked through the night together, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious to anyone watching. It was subtle, like the kind of movement you only notice when you've stopped trying to see something else. Marcus Harrison, who'd built his empire on visible success and polished confidence, was beginning to notice that the most important thing in his office might have been invisible all along. And Sophie, who'd spent 5 years being looked through rather than at, was beginning to understand that sometimes, when someone finally sees you, everything changes. The city glittered outside, indifferent to the small revolution happening on the 42nd floor. The sun rose over Manhattan like it always did, indifferent to the fact that Marcus Harrison hadn't slept. Sophie had left around 5 in the morning after insisting, with the kind of gentle firmness that Marcus was beginning to recognize as one of her defining characteristics, that at least one of them should go home and shower before the presentation. "You look like a zombie," she'd said, not unkindly, as she gathered the meticulously organized files they'd spent the night assembling. "Mr. Whitmore is less likely to trust a zombie." Marcus had actually smiled at that, a real smile, not the practiced one he deployed in board meetings and social events. It had felt strange on his face, like using muscles he'd forgotten he possessed. Now, standing under the scalding spray of his bathroom shower in his Upper West Side apartment, Marcus tried to process what had happened. In 12 hours, his entire perception of his secretary had been reconstructed. Sophie wasn't just competent. She was brilliant. She had an eye for details that bordered on obsessive, a patience for tedious work that suggested either a meditative mind or someone who'd learned to find peace in precision. She asked intelligent questions. She didn't flinch when he was frustrated. She made terrible jokes when the tension got too thick. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, when they were both punch-drunk on coffee and adrenaline, she'd made him laugh. Actually laugh. Not the polished chuckle of a successful man, but a real, genuine laugh that came from his belly and surprised them both. He couldn't quite remember what the joke was now. Marcus dressed with even more care than usual. The armor of the impeccably dressed man, the uniform of someone who'd learned that appearance could substitute for confidence when confidence was in short supply. Navy suit, crisp white shirt, tie the color of slate. He looked like a man who had everything under control, which was, of course, a lie. The office was already bustling when he arrived at 7:30. The day shift had started, and the usual hum of corporate life filled the space. Emails being sent, calls being made, the soft murmur of people pretending to work while actually checking their phones. Sophie was already at her desk. She wore a navy dress today, actually professional, actually put together in a way that suggested she'd made an effort. Her hair was down, falling in gentle waves past her shoulders. She looked up when he approached, and he saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe, or awareness of the shift that had occurred between them. "You got some sleep?" he asked. "A few hours." She smiled, and it transformed her entire face. He wondered how many times he'd missed that smile over the years. How many times she'd smiled at him and he'd simply failed to notice. "You?" "No," he admitted, "but I'm running on adrenaline at this point." Sophie pulled up a chair next to her desk, a gesture of inclusion that seemed small but felt significant. "I went through everything again this morning. The discrepancies are consistent. Whoever was doing this knew what they were doing, but they made one mistake about 4 months ago. They shifted a decimal point in the revenue projections, which created a cascade of errors in the supporting documents. That's what caught my eye initially." She was all business now, her nervousness of the previous night replaced by the focused competence of someone who knew they had something valuable to contribute. She walked him through her findings with a clarity that made the fraud almost impossible to deny. The evidence was airtight, more than airtight. It was elegant in its completeness. "This is perfect," Marcus said, meaning it. "You did this." "We did this," Sophie corrected gently. "I found the anomaly, but you're the one who understood what it meant. I was just looking at numbers." But Marcus shook his head. "You were doing what I should have been doing all along, paying attention." The presentation was scheduled for 11 o'clock. Richard Whitmore was coming to the office personally, a sign of how seriously he was taking the potential loss of $300 million. Marcus had only met with Whitmore in person a handful of times. Most of their communication happened through intermediaries and emails. The man was legendary in New York real estate circles, in his 70s, with the kind of effortless authority that came from decades of success and generational wealth. At 10:45, Sophie walked into Marcus's office with 2 cups of coffee. She set one on his desk. Black, no sugar, the way he actually preferred it, though she had no obvious way of knowing this. Had she paid attention over 5 years to the smallest details of his preferences while he'd barely registered her existence? "You're going to be fine," she said. "How do you know that?" "Because you have the truth on your side, and because—" She paused, and he could see her gathering courage. "Because you're not the villain in this story. Someone in your financial team is. You just need to present the evidence clearly and let Whitmore make his own conclusion." Marcus studied her. In the morning light filtering through his office windows, she looked exhausted and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or fashion. It was the beauty of someone who'd worked through the night to save someone else's life. "Will you come to the meeting?" he asked. Sophie looked surprised. "Is that appropriate?" "I don't care if it's appropriate," Marcus said, and he realized it was true. For the first time in a very long time, he was making a decision based on what felt right, rather than what looked right. "I want you there. You found this. You should be there when I present it." Richard Whitmore was exactly as Marcus remembered, silver-haired, with the kind of tan that suggested winter vacations in places most people would need a passport to imagine. He arrived at 11 o'clock sharp, accompanied by a lawyer and an accountant, both of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The conference room on the 42nd floor had been configured for presentation. A long table, comfortable chairs, the kind of setting designed to make people feel important. Sophie sat at the back, quiet and observant, with the files organized in front of Marcus like a hand of cards he was about to play. "I appreciate you coming in person," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the riot of anxiety in his chest. "I know your time is valuable, and I know you're skeptical about the situation here. If I were in your position, I would be too." Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "I'm listening." What happened next was, in retrospect, inevitable. Marcus walked Whitmore through the evidence, the discrepancies, the shifted decimals, the systematic alteration of financial documents. He was clear, methodical, and most importantly, he was honest about his own failures. Yes, he'd been careless with the oversight. Yes, he'd trusted people he shouldn't have. Yes, there had been poor financial controls that had enabled the fraud to occur in the first place. But the fraud itself, that wasn't his doing. Whitmore's expression shifted as the evidence accumulated. The lawyer and accountant exchanged glances. By the time Marcus finished, laying out the final document with Sophie's meticulous annotations, there was a palpable shift in the room's energy. "Who did this?" Whitmore asked quietly. "That's for the police to determine," Marcus said. "I've already contacted the authorities. The evidence is clear enough that they should be able to identify exactly who altered the documents." Whitmore stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then he turned back to Marcus. "You could have tried to cover this up," Whitmore said. Moved money around, created false explanations, delayed until you could figure out what happened. Most people in your position would have done exactly that. I thought about it, Marcus admitted, and the honesty seemed to surprise Whitmore for approximately 30 seconds. What changed your mind? Marcus glanced back at Sophie, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Someone made me see that lying was only going to make things worse, that the only way forward was the truth. Whitmore followed his gaze, and Marcus saw the moment of understanding flash across the older man's face. The investor studied Sophie for a moment, then turned back to Marcus. The project is moving forward, Whitmore said. We'll adjust for the funds that were fraudulently diverted. Your company will absorb some of those losses. That's the price of poor oversight. But the project itself remains viable, and you remain the lead developer. Marcus felt the ground beneath his feet solidify for the first time in what felt like months. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Whitmore said, and there was something almost amused in his tone. You've got a lot of work ahead of you, and better financial controls. He extended his hand, and they shook, a gesture that felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. After Whitmore and his team left, after the lawyer had been contacted and the police informed, after the machinery of justice had been set in motion, Marcus sat alone in his office. The adrenaline was wearing off, and exhaustion was crashing down on him like a wave. Sophie appeared in his doorway with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "We did it!" "You did it," Marcus corrected, but this time with less argument in his voice. "I'm going to need to figure out how to make this right." "What do you mean?" Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down for a second." Sophie sat, looking cautious, as though she was waiting for him to take back what she'd done, to find some reason to resent her for knowing about the fraud. "I've been thinking," Marcus said slowly, "about how I've treated you for 5 years, about how I never really saw you, even though you were always there, about how you spent last night saving my company while I was too blind to even notice you were in the room most of the time." "That's not—" Sophie started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish." He took a breath. "I want to fix that. Not as some grand gesture or because I feel guilty, but because something shifted last night, and I'm not willing to let it shift back. You're brilliant, and you deserve more than being invisible. So I want to offer you something." Sophie's eyes widened slightly. "What?" "A promotion," Marcus said. "Director of Project Oversight. Your own team, your own office, a salary that reflects your actual value instead of what I was paying you to be my secretary." He paused. "And if you want it, a chance to be part of building something real, something honest." Sophie stared at him. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Then quietly she said, "Is this because you feel guilty?" "Partially," Marcus admitted. And then, with the kind of honesty that was becoming easier as the adrenaline wore off, he added, "But mostly because last night, when we were working together, I remembered what it felt like to be excited about my work, about the actual work, not just the success or the prestige. And you made that happen. I want to know what that feels like more often." Sophie's eyes glistened slightly, tears threatening to spill over, though she blinked them back with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd cried in professional settings before. "Can I think about it?" "Of course," Marcus said. "Take as long as you need." She stood up, smoothing her dress. "I'm going to go home and sleep for about 16 hours, she said, and there was something almost shy in her smile. "I'll think about it after that." After she left, Marcus sat in the quiet of his office and realized something that, 6 months ago, he would have found laughable. He was more nervous about whether Sophie would accept his offer than he'd been about whether Whitmore would save his company. The city glittered outside, and for the first time in a very long time, Marcus Harrison felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Sophie spent 3 days thinking about Marcus's offer, which meant 3 days of her mother asking whether she was sick, 3 days of her best friend Jordan demanding she explain why she kept spacing out mid-conversation, and 3 days of her lying awake at night, replaying the presentation in her mind like a song she couldn't stop listening to. The thing about being invisible is that you become very good at observing people. Sophie had spent 5 years watching Marcus Harrison from the periphery of his life. She'd learned the rhythm of his moods, the tightness around his eyes on days when deals fell through, the way his shoulders relaxed when something went right. She'd noticed that he was kind to the cleaning staff, but dismissive of people he perceived as less intelligent than himself. She'd seen him reject 3 serious relationships, each with a woman who looked like she'd been hired from a catalogue of successful man's girlfriends. Aye, and she'd watched him work himself into the ground night after night, as though success was a thing that could be chased and captured if he just ran fast enough. On the 4th day, Sophie walked into his office and said, "I'll take the promotion." Marcus looked up from his desk. He was working, of course he was working, probably on something related to the restructuring that would follow the fraud investigation. And his entire face transformed. The smile was genuine, unguarded, the kind of smile that made him look approximately 5 years younger. "Yeah?" he said, and there was so much hope in that single word that Sophie felt something tighten in her chest. "Yeah," she confirmed, "but I have conditions." One of Marcus's eyebrows arched. "Conditions?" "First, I need a team of at least 3 people. People I choose, not people you assign. Second, I want real authority. I'm not a figurehead while someone else makes decisions. And third," she paused, gathering courage, "I want transparency. If there are problems, I want to hear about them directly, not through office gossip or rumors." Marcus stood up and walked around his desk. He was wearing another perfect suit. Charcoal this time, with a burgundy tie that probably cost more than Sophie's monthly rent. But she was beginning to see beyond the uniform, to the man underneath who was still learning how to be human instead of just being successful. "Those are fair conditions," he said. "I can work with all of that." "Good," Sophie said, "because I'm also going to be auditing your other projects, the ones that aren't the Metropolitan Tower. If what happened with the financial team happened once, it could happen again." Marcus's expression shifted to something almost amused. "Are you going to be difficult to work with?" "Yes," Sophie said flatly. "I'm going to be very difficult. I notice things. I ask questions. I don't accept excuses." "Perfect," Marcus said. And then, after a pause that felt weighted with something unspoken, he added, "I think we're going to do something interesting together." The next 2 weeks were chaos of the productive variety. Sophie moved into a new office, smaller than Marcus's but with a window and a door that closed, which felt impossibly luxurious after 5 years of sitting in a cubicle. She hired her team. David, a meticulous former auditor with obsessive-compulsive tendencies that made him perfect for catching financial discrepancies. Maria, a sharp-eyed project manager who could organize anything. And James, a data analyst with the kind of intuitive understanding of spreadsheets that bordered on supernatural. Together, they began the process of auditing Harrison and Associates' operations with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for criminal investigations. What they found was, thankfully, not another outright fraud. But there were inefficiencies, poor documentation, areas where corners had been cut in the name of expediency. Nothing illegal, but nothing that would have impressed an investor like Whitmore either. Sophie spent her nights writing reports and her days presenting findings to Marcus. Their office door was usually closed, which caused exactly the kind of speculation in the office that Sophie had anticipated and then decided not to care about. Let them talk. She was too busy. 3 weeks into her new position, Sophie was reviewing quarterly expense reports when her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Dinner?" She stared at the message for a long moment, reading it and rereading it like it might contain hidden meaning. Then she typed back, "Is this about work?" The response came almost immediately. "No." Sophie's heart did something complicated in her chest. She typed, "What time?" And then, before she could overthink it further, she hit send. They went to a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, the kind of place that didn't have a website and required reservations made weeks in advance. Marcus had somehow gotten a table, which Sophie discovered meant absolutely nothing because the owner apparently knew him and had simply bumped someone else. Sophie felt a flash of discomfort at the casual way he'd rearranged the evening for his own convenience, then realized that this awareness of his privilege, this willingness to call out his behavior, even internally, was probably part of why he'd hired her. "You're angry at me," Marcus said, after they'd ordered and been left alone with their wine. "Not angry," Sophie said carefully. "But I noticed you asked them to move someone's reservation." "Guilty," Marcus admitted. He took a sip of wine. "I've gotten very used to asking for things and having them appear. It's going to take me a while to break that habit." "You could have been more considerate about it," Sophie said without judgment, just stating a fact. "I could have," Marcus agreed. "Next time, I'll book the reservation earlier, or I'll ask you where you'd prefer to go, and I'll be early about making sure it works out." Sophie wasn't expecting that. The easy acceptance of her criticism, the immediate course correction. It made her feel both seen and slightly guilty for being so pointed about it. "I'm sorry if I was harsh," she said. "Don't be," Marcus replied. "I think I need people to be honest with me. I think that's been my problem for a very long time. Everyone around me just says what I want to hear." They ate pasta and talked about work, which seemed safe. Sophie had opinions about the way the architectural team was handling the Metropolitan Tower redesign, and Marcus actually listened, asking follow-up questions instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. By dessert, they'd shifted into territory that was less safe. "Why did you stay?" Marcus asked suddenly. "If I was so invisible to you, if I never really acknowledged you, why did you stay working as my secretary for 5 years?" Sophie considered the question carefully. This was dangerous territory, because the honest answer involved her watching him, noticing him, building a relationship in her head that was entirely one-sided. "Because I was afraid," she said finally. "I wanted to do more, I wanted bigger challenges, but it was safe there. I knew how to be your secretary, I knew what to expect, and She paused, then decided to be brave. "I didn't want to leave." Marcus set down his spoon. "Why not?" Sophie met his eyes, and in that moment she made a choice. She could deflect, could make a joke, could pretend there was a practical reason. Or she could be honest. "Because leaving meant admitting that nothing would change," she said quietly. "That I'd be invisible forever, to you and to everyone else. And I guess on some level I thought if I stayed close enough, if I was useful enough, eventually you'd see me." The honesty hung in the space between them. Marcus didn't look away. "I see you now," he said. And the way he said it, with absolute certainty, with the kind of focus that made her feel like she was the most important thing in his entire world, made her believe it. "You're just saying that because I saved your company," Sophie said, but there was no real conviction in her voice. "I'm saying that because in the past 3 weeks I've found myself thinking about you when I'm not supposed to be thinking about you," Marcus said. "I'm saying that because you're brilliant and brave and you don't let me get away with my bullshit. And I'm saying that because I think I want to ask you to dinner again, but not as my employee, and not as a celebration of something work-related. Just because I want to spend time with you." Sophie's mouth felt dry. "That's a terrible idea." "Why?" "Because I still work for you," Sophie pointed out. "Because there's an enormous power imbalance. Because if this goes wrong, it could destroy my career." "All true," Marcus acknowledged, "which is why I have another proposal for you." Sophie braced herself. "What?" "Resign from your position as Director of Project Oversight. I'm promoting you to Vice President of Operations. It's a higher salary, more authority, and you'd be reporting directly to the board instead of to me. That removes the power dynamic issue, and it puts you in a position where you have actual leverage if this goes south." Sophie stared at him. That's insane. I haven't even been in this position for 3 weeks. I know, Marcus said, but I've seen you work. I know what you're capable of. And more importantly, I'm tired of pretending that I hired you because of some grand revelation about your capabilities. I hired you because I wanted an excuse to spend time with you. That's not true, Sophie said. But even as she said it, she was questioning herself. How much of his offer had been about recognizing her talent, and how much had been about wanting her close? It's partially true, Marcus corrected. You are brilliant. That part is genuine. But the timing, the urgency, the way I structured the position, that was about wanting you to stay. About trying to make myself matter to you the way you mattered to me. Sophie felt tears prickling at her eyes. You're confusing gratitude with attraction. I'm not, Marcus said firmly. I know what gratitude feels like. This isn't gratitude. This is me looking at you across a desk for 3 weeks and thinking about how much I want to know you. The real you, not the version you present professionally. Sophie took a long sip of wine. If I take this promotion, if we do this, and if it doesn't work out, I don't want to have to leave the company. You won't, Marcus promised. You'll have a contract that makes it clear that you're untouchable. We end things. You still have your position. That's the deal. You're really prepared for this, Sophie observed. I talked to a lawyer, Marcus admitted with a slight smile. I wanted to make sure I wasn't being predatory or stupid or both. Despite everything, despite her fear and her caution and the rational part of her brain screaming that this was a mistake, Sophie smiled. You talked to a lawyer about asking me to dinner. I talk to lawyers about everything, Marcus said. It's a rich person thing. They finished dinner with the question still hanging in the air. Is this a good idea? The answer, Sophie was beginning to suspect, was that it didn't matter. The idea had already happened. The only question now was whether they were brave enough to follow it. Marcus walked her home, which meant they walked through the West Village in the early October evening, leaves turning color and the city smelling like possibility. They didn't hold hands. That felt too forward, too definitive. But they walked close enough that their shoulders sometimes brushed. At her apartment building, a modest 4-story walk-up that housed mostly young professionals and artists who couldn't afford Manhattan's skyrocketing rents, Marcus hesitated. If you want to wait on the promotion, he said, I can arrange something else. We don't have to move this fast. Sophie considered him. He looked uncertain in a way that didn't usually suit him, his corporate confidence stripped away to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. I'll take the promotion, she said, but I want it to be about my work, not about us. And I want to move slowly with this. She gestured between them. I don't want to rush into something just because we've worked closely together. Okay, Marcus said. And then, can I kiss you goodnight? Sophie felt her heart do something complicated. That's moving slow? It's moving at a normal pace, Marcus corrected. I think we've already skipped several steps, but we can be intentional about the rest. Sophie considered the question. Considered him. Then she stood on her tiptoes and kissed him gently, a gesture that was less about passion and more about possibility. When she pulled back, Marcus was smiling. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. Not about work. Okay, Sophie said. And as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she realized that for the first time in a very long time, she felt seen. Not by accident, not as a side effect of being useful, but genuinely, actually seen. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. It was the beginning of something that felt dangerously real. 3 months later, Sophie stood in Marcus's apartment, a sprawling penthouse in the Upper West Side with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park, and realized she had no idea how they'd gotten here. Well, that wasn't true. She knew exactly how. There had been dinners, each one slightly less formal than the last. There had been stolen moments in the office when they thought no one was looking. There had been a weekend trip to the Hamptons where Marcus had surprised her by taking her to a bookstore instead of to some exclusive club. There had been conversations that lasted until 3 in the morning, conversations where they'd told each other things that felt too real, too honest, too vulnerable. And somewhere in the middle of all that, they'd stopped pretending that this was casual. Now Sophie was standing in his kitchen, wearing one of his shirts, because hers had somehow ended up in the bedroom, and she was making breakfast while Marcus showered. It was a Sunday morning in January, and the city outside looked like it had been dusted with powdered sugar. "You're cooking," Marcus said, emerging from the bathroom with damp hair and a smile that made her stomach do backflips. "You were going to make eggs and somehow destroy the kitchen in the process," Sophie said without looking up from the pan. "I've learned that the best way to preserve your marble countertops is to take over breakfast." Marcus wrapped his arms around her from behind, and Sophie leaned back into him. This was becoming routine now, the casual domesticity of weekend mornings, the ease of having someone's body fit against yours like it was designed that way. "I love you," he said into her hair. Sophie froze. They hadn't said it before. Not explicitly, not in those specific words. They'd said, "I care about you," and "I need you," and all of the other phrases that meant the same thing, but required less vulnerability. But this was different. "Don't say that just because we're having a nice morning," Sophie said, her voice careful. "I'm not," Marcus replied. He turned her around so she was facing him, and his expression was serious in a way that made her chest tight. "I'm saying it because it's been 3 months, and I think about you constantly, because I want to be better because of you, because the thought of not having you in my life makes me feel like I can't breathe." Sophie set down the spatula. "That's a lot of pressure." "I know," Marcus said, "and I'm not asking you to say it back. I'm just telling you the truth. I love you." Sophie wanted to tell him that she loved him too. The words were right there, ready to go, backed up by months of quiet observation and feelings that had been building longer than she cared to admit. But she hesitated. "What?" Marcus asked, and she could see him trying to read her expression, trying to figure out what she was thinking. "I'm scared," Sophie admitted. "I'm scared because this is real now, and real things can break. I'm scared because I spent so long being invisible that now that I'm visible, I'm terrified of doing something wrong and becoming invisible again. And I'm scared because you're still my boss, technically, even if the dynamics have changed." Marcus stepped back slightly. "We can fix that last one. You could transfer to a different company or—" "No," Sophie interrupted. "I love my job. I love working for Harrison and Associates. What I'm saying is that I'm aware of the complications, and I need to know that you're aware of them too." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am. I've been thinking about it since the beginning. The fact that you're incredibly talented and ambitious and you could go anywhere means that you chose to stay. And part of me wonders if you stayed because of me or because you actually wanted to be here." "Both," Sophie said. "It's both. Does that bother you?" "It would bother me if it was just me," Marcus said, "but it doesn't. Because I think you're genuinely good at what you do, and I think you're genuinely happy here, and I get to be the bonus." Sophie turned back to the stove before the eggs burned. "You're not a bonus. You're—" She paused, searching for the right words. "You're the thing that makes the rest of it matter. Does that make sense?" "Yeah," Marcus said softly. "It does." They ate breakfast with the easy silence of people who'd stopped needing to fill every quiet moment with conversation. Sophie was beginning to understand that this was what real intimacy looked like. Not constant communication, but the ability to simply exist in someone's presence without feeling like you had to perform. Her phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again and again. "You should check that," Marcus said, gesturing at the phone with his coffee cup. Sophie pulled it out and felt her stomach drop. Multiple messages from her mother, from her sister, from Jordan. All variations of the same thing. "Have you seen the news?" She pulled up the New York Times website, and there it was, front and center of the business section. "Harrison and Associates faces new allegations of financial mismanagement." The article detailed how, in the wake of the fraud investigation that had been completed 3 months earlier, the SEC had opened a new inquiry into whether the fraud had been more widespread than initially discovered. Someone, the article didn't specify who, had contacted federal investigators with additional documentation suggesting that the fraudulent practices might have involved more than just the financial team. Sophie's eyes scanned the article, her heart rate picking up as she read. The allegations were vague but damaging. Questions about Marcus's oversight. Questions about whether he'd been complicit or simply negligent. "What is it?" Marcus asked, and she could see him reading over her shoulder. When he'd finished, he set down his coffee with a deliberate motion, like he was very carefully controlling his impulse to throw it across the room. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't," Sophie replied. But even as she said it, she felt something shift. This was the moment, wasn't it? This was where things got complicated. Because now there would be pressure, there would be lawyers and investigations, and the kind of scrutiny that made relationships difficult. Marcus's phone started ringing. He ignored it. "I need to handle this," he said, not looking at her. "I know," Sophie said. "This could get ugly," he continued. "There could be more allegations. There could be people trying to make me look bad, to cover their own tracks." "I know," Sophie said again. "And people are going to question whether you were involved," Marcus said, finally meeting her eyes. "Because you're dating me and you're in a position of oversight. People are going to suggest that we're covering things up together." Sophie felt cold. She hadn't thought about that angle, but of course it was there. Of course people would question her impartiality. "We have to be very careful," Marcus said, "about what we do, about how we present this. We can't give anyone any reason to think we're not handling this appropriately." "What does that mean?" Sophie asked, though she already knew. "It means we probably can't see each other," Marcus said quietly. "Not until this is resolved. Not until there's no question about your objectivity." Sophie set down her phone. She should have known this was coming. She should have been prepared for it, but she hadn't been, and she wasn't. "How long?" she asked. "I don't know," Marcus said. "Could be weeks. Could be months." They sat with that for a moment. The penthouse that had felt so intimate an hour ago now felt enormous and cold. "This is why I was scared," Sophie said finally. "This, not the pressure or the complications, but the way things can change so fast. The way something wonderful can just evaporate because of circumstances beyond your control." "We're not evaporating," Marcus said firmly. "We're being strategic. And when this is over—" "When this is over what?" Sophie interrupted. "We just pick up where we left off? We pretend we didn't have 3 months of mornings like this?" "No," Marcus said. "We move forward. We take what we've learned about each other and we build something real, something that lasts." Sophie wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this was just a pause, not an ending. But she'd spent 32 years learning that things rarely worked out the way you hoped they would. "We should tell the board," she said, shifting into professional mode as a defense mechanism. "About our relationship. We should disclose it so there's no appearance of impropriety." Marcus nodded slowly. "You're right, I'll contact the legal team this afternoon. And I should probably recuse myself from the investigation," Sophie continued. "I can oversee the other projects, but anything related to the fraud allegations should go to David or Maria." "That might be wise," Marcus agreed. They sat across from each other at the breakfast table, surrounded by cooling eggs and untouched toast, and Sophie thought about how quickly intimacy could become complication, how trust could become liability. "I hate this," she said. "I know," Marcus replied. "I do too." "Promise me something," Sophie said. "What?" "Promise me that when this is over, when the investigations are done and the allegations are settled, you'll remember that I'm the person who was willing to recuse herself from the situation. That I didn't try to protect you by covering things up. That I chose to do the right thing even though it meant stepping back from my position." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "I promise. I know who you are, Sophie. I know what you stand for. This doesn't change that." But as they cleaned up breakfast and Sophie got dressed to leave, they'd agreed she should go home to establish some distance. She wondered if that was true. She wondered if investigations and allegations had a way of making people question each other. She wondered if love was strong enough to survive being put on pause. The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity. The SEC's allegations became more specific. Documents emerged suggesting that the fraud had been more systematic than anyone initially realized. Lawyers swarmed the offices of Harrison and Associates like locusts, and the energy shifted from productive to panicked. Sophie threw herself into work with an intensity that was almost self-destructive. She recused herself from anything related to the investigation as planned, but that left her with the other projects, all of which suddenly seemed to require comprehensive review. She worked until 9 or 10 every night, ordering Thai food to her new office and eating it while staring at spreadsheets. She didn't see Marcus. They exchanged professional emails about work-related matters. Once, she saw him in the hallway, and they exchanged careful nods, like strangers who'd once been intimate. On the 14th day of what Sophie had started thinking of as the pause, Jordan called her at her apartment. "You need to stop this," Jordan said without preamble. "Stop what?" Sophie asked, though she knew exactly what. "Stop acting like you're okay with this situation when you're clearly not. I've known you for 12 years, and I have never seen you this miserable." "It's temporary," Sophie said. "When the investigations are over, the investigations are going to be over, and you're still going to be miserable if you don't deal with this," Jordan interrupted. "You love him, and he clearly loves you, and you're both acting like that doesn't matter." "It doesn't matter right now," Sophie said, "because right now what matters is making sure there's no appearance of impropriety. What matters is integrity. What matters is that you're in love," Jordan said firmly, "and integrity doesn't mean you can't acknowledge that. It means you're honest about it and you handle it appropriately, which, by the way, you already are doing." Sophie wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally, in a way that made her feel like she was drowning. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" Jordan asked gently. "Of all of it. Of this not working out. Of Marcus not being who I thought he was. Of my career being destroyed by association. Of loving someone and then losing them anyway." "Those are all legitimate fears," Jordan said. "But you know what's not a legitimate strategy? Preemptively ending things to protect yourself from the possibility that they might end anyway." After Jordan hung up, Sophie sat in her apartment, the small, modest place where she'd lived for 5 years, where she'd watched Marcus from a distance and dreamed of being visible to him, and realized her best friend was right. She was being a coward. She was using the investigations as an excuse to create distance, because distance felt safer than vulnerability. The question was whether she was brave enough to face that. The SEC hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in late February, which meant Marcus spent the entire preceding week with the legal team camped out in the conference room on the 42nd floor. Sophie knew this because she'd been avoiding that entire section of the office, taking the long way around to get to her own workspace, carefully constructing her days so that she wouldn't accidentally run into him. It was exhausting. It had been 6 weeks since they'd stopped seeing each other. 6 weeks of professional emails and careful distance. 6 weeks of her coming home to her apartment and eating dinner alone while checking her phone obsessively, waiting for a text that never came. She'd thrown herself into work with the kind of single-minded focus that usually preceded burnout. The audits of the non-fraudulent projects had become legendary in their thoroughness. She'd uncovered 3 separate instances of minor accounting errors, all of which she'd corrected and documented, establishing herself as someone who could be trusted to notice things, to care about the details, to maintain integrity even when no one was watching. It wasn't enough. None of it was enough to quiet the voice in her head that asked, "What if this is the end?" Maria knocked on her office door on the Tuesday morning of the hearing. "You should go," Maria said without preamble. "Go where?" Sophie asked, though she knew exactly where. "To the hearing. You should be there for him." Sophie set down her pen carefully. "That's not appropriate. I'm not part of his legal team. I'm not part of the investigation." "You're the person he loves," Maria said. "That's probably more relevant." Sophie wanted to explain that love was irrelevant in a situation like this. She wanted to explain that by being there, she would be making a statement, and statements had consequences. But instead, she found herself saying, "He hasn't asked me to come." "He wouldn't," Maria replied. "He's been protecting you for 6 weeks by staying away." "But that doesn't mean he doesn't want you there." Sophie stared at her computer screen, at the spreadsheet she'd been reviewing. The numbers blurred together as her eyes lost focus. "I'm scared," she said quietly. "I know," Maria said. She'd worked with Sophie long enough to understand that fear wasn't something to minimize or dismiss. It was something to acknowledge and move through. But sometimes you have to be scared and do the thing anyway. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was all marble and intimidation, the kind of building designed to make you feel small. Sophie stood outside for 10 minutes, gathering courage, watching lawyers in expensive suits stride past her with the kind of confidence that came from billing $300 an hour. She was wearing her best dress, a deep blue that made her feel slightly more armored, and she'd done her hair and makeup with the kind of care that suggested she cared about her appearance, which felt dishonest because what she actually cared about was not completely falling apart. Inside the courtroom, she found a seat in the back. Marcus was at the front, flanked by his legal team, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past 6 weeks. There were dark circles under his eyes. His suit, while impeccably tailored, seemed to hang on him differently, like he'd lost weight. Sophie's heart clenched. The hearing proceeded with the kind of formal tedium that only the legal system could manage. Questions were asked. Documents were presented. Marcus answered everything calmly and clearly, owning his mistakes while carefully distinguishing between negligence and complicity. It was during the lunch break that he saw her. She was standing in the hallway, trying to look like she belonged there, when Marcus emerged from the courtroom with his lead attorney. He stopped dead when he saw her. "Sophie," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer and an accusation simultaneously. "I'll give you a moment," his attorney said diplomatically, and disappeared into the crowd. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked. He looked torn between relief and concern, like seeing her was both the best thing that had happened all week and also potentially a disaster. "Maria told me to come," Sophie said. Then more honestly, "I wanted to come. I've been wanting to come since the hearing was scheduled." "You shouldn't have," Marcus said, though he didn't move away from her. "People are going to see you and draw conclusions. People are going to say you're here to support me, which could be interpreted as a conflict of interest." "I'm here to support you," Sophie replied, "and I don't care if people draw conclusions. I'm tired of pretending that I don't care about you to protect some abstract idea of professionalism." Marcus's expression shifted. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've been a coward," Sophie said, her voice low and urgent. "I'm saying that 6 weeks ago, when you suggested we stop seeing each other until this was over, I agreed because it seemed like the responsible thing to do. But the truth is, I agreed because I was scared, and I've spent 6 weeks being scared, and I'm exhausted." "Sophie?" Marcus started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish," she said. "I've been thinking about what integrity means. I've been thinking about it constantly, and I think integrity means being honest, even when it's uncomfortable, even when people might judge you for it. And I'm tired of judging myself. I'm tired of pretending that love is less important than appearing professional." "This hearing could go either way," Marcus said quietly. "The SEC still hasn't determined whether they think I was complicit. If things go badly, I don't want you to be associated with that." "Too late," Sophie said. "I'm already associated with it. I've been associated with you since the day I saved your company, and I don't regret it. I don't regret any of it." Marcus looked around the hallway, at the people walking past them, at the security cameras, at all the evidence that this conversation was happening in a very public place. "I love you," he said, and it felt like a confession, like he was admitting to something that had cost him to hide for 6 weeks. "I have loved you since you walked into my office at 1 in the morning with coffee stains on your blouse and a file folder that changed everything. I have been in love with you for 6 months, and I have been miserable for 6 weeks." Sophie felt tears prickling at her eyes. "So we're not waiting anymore?" "No," Marcus said. "We're not waiting. I don't care what people think. I don't care what the SEC thinks. I care about you, and I'm not spending another day pretending I don't." He kissed her right there in the hallway of the federal courthouse, in front of lawyers and security guards and anyone else who happened to be walking past. It was not a subtle kiss. It was a statement. It was a choice. When he pulled back, Sophie was smiling through tears. "You're going to win this hearing," she said. "How do you know?" Marcus asked. "Because you're going to walk back in there and tell the truth, the way you always do when it matters. And the truth is that you made mistakes, but you didn't commit fraud. The truth is that you corrected the situation the moment you became aware of it. The truth is that you're a good person who did the wrong thing for about 30 seconds and then made it right." Marcus studied her face. "You believe that?" "I know that," Sophie said. "I've watched you work. I've seen the way you treat people when you think no one's looking. I've read every email you've sent, every memo you've written, every communication that was part of the investigation. And I know who you are. The SEC's ruling came down 3 weeks later. They determined that while Marcus had exercised poor financial oversight and inadequate internal controls, there was no evidence that he'd been knowingly complicit in the fraud. The fraud had been perpetrated by his financial team, specifically by a man named Derek Richardson, who'd been systematically altering documents for 18 months. Derek was arrested. Marcus's company was fined, but remained operational. The scandal became page 6 gossip instead of headlines, and for the first time in months, Sophie and Marcus could breathe. They started small, a dinner at the same Italian restaurant where Marcus had first told her he was in love with her. They walked through Central Park on a Saturday afternoon, holding hands without looking around to see if anyone was watching. They went back to his apartment and slept until noon, something Sophie had never done before in her life. 3 weeks after the SEC's ruling, Marcus took Sophie to dinner at a restaurant that required reservations 6 months in advance. This time, he'd actually booked the reservation properly, showing up early and waiting patiently for the owner to find them a table. They were halfway through their entrees when Marcus pulled out a small velvet box. Sophie actually dropped her fork. "Are you—" she started, but Marcus held up a hand. "I'm not doing this tonight," he said, and Sophie felt her heart sink. "I'm just showing you what I've been carrying around for the past month, waiting for the right moment." He opened the box to reveal a ring, not ostentatious, not the kind of diamond that announced itself loudly, but a perfect emerald-cut diamond on a platinum band that caught the light like water. "I want to marry you," Marcus said. "Not tomorrow, not next month, but soon. Soon enough that it feels real, soon enough that I'm not spending every day wondering if I'm going to wake up and find out you've changed your mind." "I won't change my mind," Sophie said. "I know," Marcus replied, "but I want to make sure you can't. I want to make sure you're mine, officially and legally and in every way that matters." Sophie looked at the ring, at Marcus, at the restaurant full of people eating dinner and living their lives around them. "When?" she asked. "June," Marcus said. "Give us 6 months to plan something that's actually us, not something that looks like what people think a wedding should be. Something with your mother and your sister and Jordan. Something with my parents, who are probably going to cry for 3 hours straight. Something that means something." "June," Sophie repeated. Then she smiled. "Okay, June. Yes. Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, which somehow felt like proof that they'd made the right decision. The office found out about the engagement before she even took her ring to work. Somehow, mysteriously, the restaurant manager had apparently mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else, and by the time Sophie arrived at Harrison and Associates on Monday morning, there was a bottle of champagne on her desk with a note that said, "Finally, the office." David, Maria, and James took her to lunch to celebrate. Marcus sent her flowers with a note that said only, "I love you." And Sophie, sitting at her desk in her office on the 42nd floor, wearing an emerald-cut diamond on her left hand, understood something that she'd been learning slowly over the past 6 months, that being seen, truly seen and loved for who you actually are was worth every risk, worth every complication, every moment of fear, every second of uncertainty. She'd spent 32 years being invisible, and now, finally, she was home. June arrived with the kind of perfect weather that felt like vindication. The day before her wedding, Sophie stood in her childhood home in Connecticut, a modest 2-story house with a wraparound porch and her mother's obsessively maintained garden, and felt like she was inhabiting someone else's life. "Stop fidgeting," her mother said, pinning the last curl into place. Margaret Chen had been the single mother of 2 daughters, working as a nurse, and somehow managing to instill in Sophie both a profound belief in hard work and a debilitating fear of failure. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a sharper wit, and she'd been skeptical about Marcus for approximately 30 seconds before recognizing that he was genuinely terrified of disappointing her. "I'm not fidgeting," Sophie lied. "You are," her sister Rachel confirmed, from where she sat on Sophie's childhood bed, scrolling through her phone. Rachel was 4 years younger, worked in graphic design, and had the kind of effortless confidence that Sophie had spent a lifetime cultivating artificially. "You're fidgeting like you're about to have a panic attack." "I'm not having a panic attack," Sophie said. "Not yet," Rachel agreed, "but the night is young." Sophie looked at herself in the mirror. The dress was perfect. Simple, elegant, the kind of thing that whispered rather than shouted. Her hair was down, the way Marcus preferred it. Her makeup was subtle. She looked like herself, just better. "You look beautiful," her mother said, and she said it in the way that mothers do, like it was a fact that required no elaboration or agreement. "I'm terrified," Sophie admitted. Margaret sat down on the bed next to Rachel. "Of what?" "Of all of it," Sophie said. "Of the ceremony, of saying the vows, of committing to something for the rest of my life. Of waking up in 10 years and realizing that I've made a terrible mistake. That's not going to happen," Rachel said. "You don't know that," Sophie replied. "No, but I do know that Marcus looked like he might actually spontaneously combust when he saw your dress at the fitting," Rachel said. "And I know that he's been texting you approximately every 6 minutes since he left yesterday. And I know that you're in love with him in a way that I've literally never seen before." Sophie pulled up the text thread on her phone. The most recent message, sent an hour ago, read, "42 hours until I get to call you my wife. I'm freaking out. Is it normal to be this terrified?" She'd responded, "Yes, me too." And then he'd written, "Okay, good. We're terrified together." Margaret took Sophie's hand. "Your father and I were terrified when we got married," she said. Margaret had been widowed for 12 years. Sophie's father had died when she was 20. He was everything I wanted, and nothing like what I'd planned for. But I knew, even being terrified, that he was the person I wanted to be terrified with. Sophie felt tears threatening her carefully applied makeup. "Don't cry," Rachel said immediately. "You'll ruin everything." The ceremony took place in a garden in the Connecticut countryside, at a venue that Sophie had chosen specifically because it wasn't trying to be fancy. There were string lights and simple white flowers, and approximately 150 people, which Marcus's mother had somehow managed to organize, despite Sophie's insistence that they keep it small. Sophie had never been the kind of woman who dreamed about her wedding. She'd been the kind of woman who didn't dare dream about anything, because dreams required the kind of visibility and hope that she'd learned to suppress. But walking down the aisle toward Marcus, who was standing at the altar, looking like he might actually explode from the force of his own emotion, she realized that this moment was worth every dream she'd never allowed herself to have. Marcus wore a navy suit, not a tuxedo, because he'd refused, saying he felt like a penguin in formal wear. His hair was carefully styled, but there was something undone about him, something that suggested he'd been running his hand through it in nervous anticipation. When she reached him, he took her hand like she might disappear if he didn't anchor her. "Hi," he whispered. "Hi," Sophie whispered back. The ceremony was short. They'd written their own vows, which meant that Sophie had to stand in front of 150 people and say things that she'd practiced for weeks and still wasn't entirely sure she could get through without crying. "I spent 32 years being invisible," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that were definitely happening now. "I spent that time learning how to be useful instead of visible, learning how to disappear instead of taking up space. And then you saw me. Not because I suddenly became louder or demanded attention, but because you actually looked. And once you looked, everything changed. I don't want to be invisible anymore. I don't want to spend my life taking up less space to make other people comfortable. I want to be here, fully, completely, exactly as I am. And I want to do that with you." Marcus's eyes were wet. His hands were shaking. "I was lost," he said when it was his turn. "I had everything that was supposed to make me happy. Success, money, status, and I was completely lost. And then you organized my files and found a number I was missing, and you didn't just save my company, you saved me. You made me realize that all the things I thought mattered didn't matter. What mattered was being seen by you. What mattered was seeing you back. What matters is this. Right here, right now, promising to keep looking at you, to keep seeing you for the rest of my life." The reception was held in a tent in the same garden. There was dancing and terrible speeches, and Sophie's mother crying quietly throughout dinner. Marcus's father gave a toast that was approximately 40% jokes and 60% genuine affection for his son. Jordan gave a speech that recounted the entire story of how Sophie had gotten Marcus's company to the brink of destruction and then saved it, which was technically accurate, but somehow made it sound way more dramatic than it had actually been. "To Sophie," Jordan concluded, raising her glass, "for making my best friend visible, and for being brave enough to love someone even when it was scary. And to Marcus for finally figuring out what everyone else already knew, that Sophie Chen is the best person in this room." Everyone applauded, and Sophie felt Marcus squeeze her hand under the table. Around midnight, when the reception had wound down and most of their guests had headed to the hotel or back to their homes, Sophie and Marcus slipped away. They'd arranged to stay at the venue overnight, in a small cottage on the grounds that had been converted into a bridal suite. In the quiet of that cottage, with the sound of crickets outside and the wedding still echoing in Sophie's bones, Marcus helped her out of her dress and into bed. They didn't have sex. They were both too emotionally wrung out for that. Instead, they lay in the dark, tangled together, and talked. "I have something I want to tell you," Marcus said after several minutes of comfortable silence. "What?" Sophie asked. "I hired an investigator," Marcus said carefully, "about 4 months ago, after you started working at the company. I wanted to know if you were who you said you were, if there was any possibility that you were part of the fraud." Sophie should have been angry. Instead, she found herself laughing. "You investigated me." "I investigated you," Marcus confirmed, "and the investigator came back and said that you were exactly who you presented yourself to be. Hardworking, honest, no secret connections to Derek Richardson or any of the other perpetrators of the fraud. Clean as a whistle." "And if I hadn't been clean?" Sophie asked. "Then I wouldn't have offered you the promotion," Marcus said. "I would have had to report it to the authorities, but I'm telling you now because I want there to be no secrets between us. I want to start this marriage with complete honesty. Sophie considered this. A year ago, she might have been hurt by this revelation. A year ago, she might have seen it as a betrayal of trust. But she understood now that Marcus had been protecting himself, not from fraud, but from falling in love with someone who might break his heart. I appreciate the honesty, she said, even though it makes you sound like a paranoid billionaire. I was, Marcus admitted. I was paranoid and terrified and desperately in love with someone who was supposed to be invisible to me. Sophie propped herself up on an elbow and looked at him in the darkness. I have something I want to tell you, too. What? I've been keeping a journal, Sophie said, since the beginning. Not a diary exactly, but detailed notes about every project we've worked on together. Everything I noticed about you, everything I observed about the company, everything I learned. It's all documented. Why? Marcus asked. Because I was scared, Sophie admitted. I was scared that if something went wrong, if you decided you didn't want me around, I would have nothing but memories of being useful. I wanted proof that I'd mattered. I wanted documentation of being seen. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I read it?" "Yes," Sophie said, "but not tonight. Tonight, I just want to be here with you. No documentation, no proof, no insurance policy, just this." She kissed him, and it felt like a promise. It felt like the beginning of something that was real enough not to need verification. They flew to Italy the next day for their honeymoon. 2 weeks in a villa in Tuscany that Marcus's assistant had booked with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that Sophie was beginning to recognize as a requirement of working for him. They made love in every room of the villa. They argued about money and work, and whether Sophie should have her own office outside of Harrison and Associates, where she'd been offered a partnership position that would have made her equal to Marcus. She accepted the office and turned down the partnership. She wanted autonomy, but she didn't want to be equal. She wanted to be herself, which was something different entirely. They got drunk on local wine and talked about children, whether they wanted them, how many, what kind of parents they wanted to be. They didn't make any decisions, but they made promises to keep talking, to keep deciding together, to never assume anything about what the other person wanted. On their last night in Tuscany, Sophie sat on the villa's terrace and looked out at the rolling hills of the Italian countryside and understood something fundamental. Happiness wasn't a destination. It wasn't something you arrived at and then stayed permanently. It was a practice, a choice made every single day to keep looking at each other, to keep being honest, to keep choosing the person in front of you even when other options might exist. "You're thinking too hard," Marcus said, coming up behind her with 2 glasses of wine. "I'm thinking about permanence," Sophie said. "I'm thinking about whether anything can last forever." "Nothing lasts forever," Marcus said, settling into the chair next to hers. "But we can last a long time if we keep trying. We can last for decades if we keep choosing each other." "I like that," Sophie said. "The idea of lasting, rather than forever. Forever sounds exhausting." "It does," Marcus agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the Tuscan hills. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." "What?" Sophie asked, bracing herself, because she'd learned that declarations often contained complications. "I've been thinking about the company," Marcus said, "about what you said regarding autonomy. I've decided to step back from day-to-day operations. I want to focus on the vision and strategy. Let you and a few others handle the actual execution. It means you'll have more responsibility, but it also means you'll have more control." Sophie turned to look at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it affects you," Marcus said simply. "Because I'm learning that the partnership, the real one, the one that matters, is with you. And I can't make decisions that significantly impact your life without consulting you first." Sophie felt something in her chest expand. "That's very evolved of you." "I'm working on it," Marcus said. "I'm learning from the best." They returned to New York on a Sunday evening in late June. The office didn't know what to expect from them. Whether they'd come back changed, whether the marriage would affect their work dynamic, whether everything would be different. Everything was different. Sophie moved into her new office, a corner suite on the 42nd floor with windows that overlooked Central Park. Marcus implemented his reduced role, stepping back from daily operations and focusing instead on major strategic decisions. And somehow, miraculously, the company not only survived the transition, it thrived. Over the next year, Harrison and Associates expanded into 3 new markets. The Metropolitan Tower project was completed ahead of schedule and under budget. New partnerships were forged, new talent was recruited, new opportunities emerged. But more importantly, Sophie and Marcus figured out how to be married to someone you worked with. They set boundaries. They maintained professionalism. They never talked about work at home, which meant they talked about everything else. Their dreams, their fears, the small moments of their days that had nothing to do with business. And one evening, about 14 months after they'd met in his office at 1 a.m, Sophie walked into their apartment to find Marcus cooking dinner. He'd gotten better at it over the year they'd been married. Not good enough that he didn't occasionally burn things, but enthusiastic in a way that made up for his lack of skill. "Smells amazing," Sophie said, kissing him on the cheek. "It's terrible," Marcus admitted cheerfully, "but I'm committed to the bit at this point." They sat down to eat, and somewhere between the first course and the second, Marcus said, "I've been thinking." "That's usually dangerous," Sophie replied. "I want to have a baby," Marcus said, "with you, sometime in the next year or two. I want to create something that's ours, that's not about the company or success or any of the things I used to care about. I want to have a kid with you and watch you become a mother and be terrified about whether I'm doing it right." Sophie set down her fork. They'd talked about children before, in abstract terms, in maybe someday terms. But this was concrete. This was Marcus saying he wanted to build a future, a real future, with her. "I want that too," Sophie said. And she meant it with a depth of certainty that surprised her. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "Okay then, let's do it." Sophie became pregnant 6 months later, on a night when they weren't trying particularly hard, which somehow seemed fitting for their relationship. Things worked out when they stopped forcing them. She gave birth to a daughter on a cold January evening, 7 years and 1 month after she'd walked into Marcus's office with a file folder full of evidence that would change everything. They named her Emma, which meant whole or universal, and Sophie felt like the name was a metaphor for the life she'd built. She'd started out fragmented, broken into a version that was useful and a version that was hidden. Emma represented the integration of those two selves, the whole person, visible and valuable, completely and entirely real. Holding Emma in the hospital, with Marcus asleep in the chair next to them, and the city glittering outside the window, Sophie thought about the woman she'd been. The woman who'd been invisible, who'd made herself small to take up less space, who'd loved someone from the periphery of his life because she didn't believe she deserved to be central to it. That woman had done something brave. That woman had walked into her boss's office at 1 a.m. and said, "I found something." That woman had been willing to be wrong, to be visible, to take the risk of mattering to someone. And that woman had been right. She did matter. She had always mattered, long before anyone else could see it. Emma opened her eyes and looked up at Sophie. And Sophie understood something that took her 34 years to learn. Invisibility wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you chose over and over again until one day you chose differently. And once you chose differently, everything changed. 10 years later, Sophie stood in her office on the 42nd floor of what was now called Harrison and Associates, Chen Division. A name change that Marcus had insisted upon despite Sophie's protests. Emma was 10 years old now, smart and confident in a way that Sophie had never been at that age. She had her mother's analytical mind and her father's instinctive understanding of how systems worked. There were 2 other children now, Thomas, age 7, and Clara, age 4. The apartment in the Upper West Side had been replaced by a townhouse in Brooklyn with a garden that Marcus tended obsessively and badly. There was talk of Sophie running for a position on the board of a non-profit focused on financial literacy for young women. There was talk of Marcus writing a book about his experiences with fraud and recovery. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, Sophie was sitting at her desk when a young woman walked in without an appointment. She was nervous, fidgeting with the strap of her bag, looking like she wanted to disappear into the walls. Sophie recognized the look because she'd worn it once. "Can I help you?" Sophie asked gently. "I was hoping to speak with someone about a discrepancy I found," the young woman said quietly. "I work in accounting, and I noticed something that doesn't add up. But I was scared to report it, and I thought maybe you might." Sophie smiled. "Tell me what you found." As the woman laid out her evidence, incomplete, still rough, but clearly the product of careful observation, Sophie thought about invisible women and the moments that changed everything. She thought about the number that had been missing, the file folder that had arrived at 1 in the morning, the choice to be brave. "You did exactly the right thing," Sophie told the young woman. "And I want you to know something. Being the person who notices things, being the person who pays attention, being the person who has the courage to speak up, that's not a burden. That's a gift. That's power." The woman looked surprised, as though no one had ever told her that her invisible work had value. Sophie knew that feeling. "What's your name?" Sophie asked. "Jessica," the woman replied. "Okay, Jessica," Sophie said. "Let me show you how to document this properly, and then we're going to present it to the board together, and you're going to see that being noticed, being heard, being valued, that's not something that happens by accident. It's something you build every single day by being brave enough to matter."